weaving them together as we go along. Finally, on Wednesday, we tackled two very different things. In the morning, I'm going to make the point that today we took science for granted. That is, we just simply, as I'm going to show you right now, I'm just going to take the results of evolutionary theory, the results of thermodynamics, the results of topology, which is the most abstract form of geometry, as if they were objective knowledge, and I'm not going to go into how they produce that objective knowledge. I'm not going to deal with epistemology today. I'm simply going to talk about the results and how they apply to the question of getting rid of Aristotelian essences. But at some point we have to deal with that, because it's not as if I believe in the light of reason or something, and I believe in scientists being possessed by the light of reason and just shining the light of reason over things and by their own genius discovering the objective knowledge. I don't believe in that. We need to explain how scientists have produced that knowledge. Scientists in all their fallibility, scientists in all their, with all their personality traits, like being, desiring fame and desiring prestige and desiring money and being just human beings. The social aspects of science, we need to come up with them, because if we're going to be borrowing from science today, we cannot do that uncritically. Eventually we have to return to the question of, well, yeah, but what is now science in this materialism? How have they produced that knowledge? Deleuze himself did some work on that. He, in a book that he wrote with Felix Guattari called 1,000 Plateaus, he talks about two different types of science. Royal science, the very prestigious science of the Royal Societies of London and the Royal Academies of Paris, and all the incredible prestigious scientists, and then the science of all the workers that are in the laboratory, the science, what he calls minor science. All those people whose names we don't even remember, because we remember Newton and we remember Einstein. Very few people remember who, for instance, was Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke was creating all the machines that eventually Newton and others used to do their demonstrations of a particular law of nature. But all those workers are completely forgotten. And as Deleuze argues, it is those workers who have a more intimate knowledge of materiality. The cream of science, all those very, very famous names that are the stuff that history of science is made out of, are actually, and despite their fame and despite their high intelligence, are ultimately Aristotelian. They're ultimately trying to make us believe in these eternal and immutable laws of nature. And so in that class, on Wednesday morning, I'm going to try to get rid of the laws of nature without getting rid of the objective content of science. That is a hard juggling job. You're like juggling like 10 balls in the air at the same time. Because you don't want that theological fossil, the laws, because the laws of nature, what could they possibly be but the laws of God? Right? So you're introducing God through the back door. How do you get that content without without law talk? Deleuze offers us a way of milking all the objective content from science without buying into their own public relations presentation of their own results. And the science that emerges from that is way more interesting than the science of textbooks, because it doesn't just stay with the famous guys, it goes into what the little guys do. And the little guys often do the most important work. First of all, they are the most numerous, but they are also the ones that are building microscopes and building telescopes and conducting little experiments and really intervening into reality instead of just representing it. And therefore they are the ones that are more trustworthy. Deleuze was the first one to point out this difference. He didn't really, the chapter on 1,000 Plateaus where he discusses this is just one chapter, and the stuff on science is just one section of that chapter. The chapter is called Nomadology and deals with the nomads from the steppes, like the Huns of Attila the Hun, and the Mongols of Genghis Khan, and so on, which of course has nothing to do with science proper. And So he only dedicates a few pages. So what we need to do on Wednesday morning is to expand those 3 or 4 or 5 pages into a complete theory of what science is in its social aspects. Finally, in the last class on Wednesday evening, we are going to now reconstitute the Deleuzian point of view, the Deleuzian worldview, and I'm going to give you now, having gathered all the different elements throughout the first 5 classes, now we have all the elements to put them together into a worldview. We're going to discuss ethics, in particular the ethics of Spinoza. Spinoza can be said to be the first modern materialist, and many of the things we're going to be saying, Spinoza lived in the 17th century, so you can imagine, he didn't have access to any, he only had access to the physics of Descartes. He didn't even have access to anything modern in any way, and so it is amazing that he was able to come up with ideas, given that very small database, so to speak, that he started with, that he was able to come up with ideas that are valid today. In fact, the materialism that we're going to be talking about in these 3 days is Spinozian materialism. And the ethics we're going to be talking about implicitly in the next 3 days. Tomorrow I'm going to have to raise ethical questions when we discuss economic power, for instance. But I'm not going to discuss the basis of that ethics until Wednesday. So Spinoza will be present with us throughout these days because he was the first one to single out all the different things. And then on that last class, I'm even going to go into subjects that I would never go into, such as the subject of God. I call it the G word, which is a 4-letter word for me, even though it only has 3 words. It has like some kind of hidden word there. I never, ever, ever use the word God. I never ever use the word spirituality, because the moment you use those 2 words, you immediately become a New Age hippie from California, right? and don't let the ponytail confuse you, people. I am not a hippie. Nevertheless, there is a way of bringing it up within Spinozian ethics. Spinoza was the first one who said, look, there's a big difference in thinking of God as a personal entity, that can listen to your prayers, and that can stage little morality plays to see who sins and who doesn't sin, and then send someone to hell and someone to heaven and so on. It's one thing to think about God as a personal entity, and an entirely different thing to think about God as an impersonal entity, as something that doesn't resemble humanity in the least. In the biblical God, in particular, is supposed to have made us to his image and semblance, meaning he looks like us, and we look like him. So there's a certain resemblance that when you meet God for the first time, you should be able to say, wow, this is familiar. This is something, I now know what the meaning of life is, because it is something that was always familiar. When you meet the Spinozian God, you'll be scared shitless, right? Because it's like so impersonal. He doesn't give a damn about it. He doesn't even know who you are. It's just what Deleuze calls the plane of immanence. It's a spiritual plane, but that has absolutely nothing human about it. Another difference between the Spinozian God and the biblical God is that the biblical God is transcendent, whereas the Spinozian God is immanent. The difference is this. A transcendent space, such as heaven or hell, would still exist if all the matter and energy in the universe disappeared. Say that you have a special super neutron gun that's going to destroy every single atom in the universe and every single electron. There's nothing else material. Well, that heaven would still be there, and hell would still be there. But the Spinozian God is immanent, which means that even though it is not reducible to matter and energy, it needs some matter or some energy to exist. So in that class, we're going to explain what immanence is. We're going to explain what impersonality is. We're going to explain the kind of ethics that it gives rise to. It's not the ethics of good and evil. It's the ethics of right and wrong. But an ethics of right and wrong that is directly material. And we're also going to explain